my darling viewers, it's Jen here at Check Her Joy. This time I'm reviewing Moonbound, Apollo 11 and the Dream of Spaceflight by Jonathan Fetter-Vorm. This is a graphic novel, and it tells the story of the Apollo 11 mission, where man first landed on the moon, but also kind of the history of spaceflight and mankind's fascination with what else is out there about space travel and about the moon in particular, and how it has always captured our imagination. So it does this by switching back and forth between the Apollo 11 mission and the history of everything that happened to get us there. So we're alternating between these chapters that are the actual Apollo 11 mission, following the astronauts up in space, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, as they're actually doing the moon landing and taking it through step by step. So it does a good job of capturing the personalities of these characters. We have the video transmissions that were being made. We have transcripts of the audio that was going back and forth, and incorporating that into this narrative so that it feels very alive and very much happening. I also enjoy just getting to be able to see it. So the images of the moon that we have, they're so grainy. I mean, it's amazing that we even got television feed from the moon, but you can't always tell what's happening, and it's blurry. So being able to see it actually visually, happening. And we have photographs, but it's also cool to just be here's the moon. I don't know. I really enjoyed following the Apollo 11 mission. That's one of the highlights of this book, and it takes in the bigger scope of everything that was happening. So we're following the main astronauts, but we're also following the flight commanders and the engineers, everybody who's in Houston, the nurse who had to check them before they went up into space. And it doesn't gloss over some of the rougher parts of the mission. I found this hilarious, this one scene where they just depict what the moon landing site looks like currently after they've left. I mean, we've kind of got them leaving, but because there's no atmosphere, because there's no wind on the moon blowing stuff around, this is also what it looks like currently. The flags got knocked over. We've got all their trash jettisoned. I mean, it's important that they got rid of as much weight as possible, but there's bags of urine sitting on the moon currently in their boots. So the little tiny tidbits that make this very personal and very real are some of the things that I loved best about this graphic novel. So this is half the book, is following the Apollo 11 mission, and this is all in full color. The other half of the book is looking at man's fascination with space and rocketry and just really traveling, and it does it in this monochrome style. So we're starting with ancient civilizations and our stories about the moon. For as long as humans have been telling stories to each other, we've been looking up in the sky and seeing that glowing orb and making up tales about it, about different entities that have been up there, about what it could be made out of, using it to tell stories. So I found all of that fascinating. It also takes us through the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. We're looking at Kepler and Galileo and Sir Isaac Newton as they're figuring out telescopes and getting to see these planetary orbs for the first time. We're figuring out how the orbits work in this time period and just imagining if we could get there, what would we find? And one of them, I think it's Kepler, has a dream about he opens up a door and he ends up on the moon. He's walking there, and how we're fulfilling that with the Apollo 11 mission and actually finding out what it is. It also talks us through the beginnings of rocketry and how we had to figure it out step by step. How do we shoot a rocket up there? How do we use gunpowder? How much gunpowder? What other substances can we use? Exactly how fast do we need to get it out of the atmosphere? Really just building it all along the way. It also doesn't skim over some of the rougher parts of this. These were actual humans. They've done good and bad. Particularly Wernher von Braun, who was our lead NASA engineer, who made the Saturn V rocket that actually got us up into space. He was a Nazi. He used to work for the Nazi Party. He was building the V2 rocket that was going into Europe and bombing England and killing allies. And the V2 rocket was built with slave labor from the concentration camps. So this does not gloss over the bad parts of our history and incorporates it and explains it, But at the same time, would we have gotten as far without those things happening? Would we have done it as fast? It also looks at the space race and how we're competing against the Soviets. It doesn't gloss over the Soviets actually were leading for a while. They kept beating us, just barely. They got the first person into space. They got the first person to orbit. They got the first female astronaut. They had the first animals in space. Like, just up until Apollo 11, up until the Apollo project, the Soviets just kept beating us and inching us out little by little. They had Sputnik up. It was the first man-made object in space. So it doesn't gloss over any of that. But it also gives us an aspect, it also gives us this visual of like what it takes to be an astronaut, what kind of training they had to do, how they selected the Mercury astronauts, how they selected the ones for Gemini, which came after. And looking at some of the things we had to figure out and work out before we could get to the moon. Like, you have to figure out if you can, a man can exist outside a capsule. Like, once you get into space, okay, now can you get out of the spaceship? How do physics work in space? Because it's different when you're in orbit versus when you get out of orbit. Like, it completely flips, honestly, because you have to start thinking about where you are altitudinally and like. The book also looks at a lot of other unsung heroes. We have a lot of the females who are working at NASA. It talks about the women who were trained to be astronauts who didn't get to be. It talks about Margaret Hamilton, who was a computer programmer, and she actually ends up programming the landing computer. It talks about Katherine Johnson and Mary Jackson, who were black programmers, and Mary Jackson being a black engineer, and their roles in this. So it does a good job of like giving us an overview of everything that was happening in exactly the large scope. So it was like 400,000 people who it took to get 3 men to the moon. But it does a good job of trying to put faces, and because it's a graphic novel, you actually get to see faces of who some of these engineers and flight controllers were, which I really enjoyed getting to see it. It's one thing when you're reading a book or you're listening to an audio when you get, you hear about these things, maybe they have a couple of pictures, but to actually like see it drawn out and see it as action is the highlight of a graphic novel of this kind, I think. And then the last part of this is the epilogue, where we kind of look at the legacy Apollo 11 had, what happened when they got back to Earth, but also the impact it's had on the space program, on our imaginations, how we basically did the impossible. Like, there's so many things along the way that could have not worked out. We could have not made it to the moon. Even going on the Apollo 11 mission, there was like a 50-50 chance that they weren't coming back, that something could have gone wrong, either in the moon landing itself, or with the rockets, or getting the trajectories wrong. If you're just a little bit off, if you're just like, your trajectory is just a little bit off, you're going to miss the moon and keep going. If coming back, you might not hit the right angle on the atmosphere, and you could burn up on re-entry. So the fact that we successfully made it to the moon in the first place is amazing. And I love just getting to see all of that in this book and everything it took, and just visually seeing it. The art itself is pretty stunning. I can't find it now, but like, my favorite visual from this graphic novel was actually seeing the landing computer and taking it apart, because it was woven together. So like, there's an actual physical hardware aspect to the program itself, where they wove the wire, and whether or not it went through a ring or around the ring was corresponding to a 0 or 1 in basic programming. So I loved seeing that. I can't find it now, but here's like the pattern they used for the spacesuits. So the spacesuits themselves were sewn together by actual seamstresses. So we have women like putting the pieces together, and like women who worked at Playtex, people who would normally be working on bras, were the people who made the spacesuit. So I love the little details of this book and how it really highlights individual contributions, but also is looking at a very large aspect, a very large picture, a very overview of everything it had to take. So like, we can't get into every single person's contribution, but we can talk about things about how the spacesuits were made and how the programming computer was knitted together Like, it's an actual physical program, which I thought was so cool. And really just getting to see the technology they're using in the 60s, like these old school computers that take up an entire room. And there's also just a lot of really amazing art where we're looking at the grand scope of, here's the rocket leaving Earth and like what that looks like. Like, the art itself can be so gorgeous on its own. The rocket actually launching, like, these are also some of my favorite panels. And what makes it stand out being a graphic novel and really using that to its advantage. So we get to tell the story, but we also get to show the story, which is so awesome. There is also a really brief foreword by Michael Collins, who was the command pilot. So he stayed in the Columbia rocket that orbited the moon, the Columbia module that orbited the moon, so that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong could, get back to Earth. And he talks about the importance of graphic novels and how he used to read, like, Flash Gordon comics, and how cool it is that, like, this is now being brought in a visual format like that, which is pretty cool. So on the whole, this is like a 4 or 5 star read for me, out of 5. It's amazing. I was also reading a couple of other books about the moon program around the same time, so sometimes those other books did it better and explained it more in depth. But as an overview, this does an amazing job of just like, here are the basics, here's everything it took, and really giving you a sense of everything that it took, which I loved. Age level wise, this is an adult graphic novel, so giving it to an adult or teen, maybe a preteen. It does get into some of the science and how things work, so I don't know how Thunder! Hi guys. I don't know how accessible it would be to like a 10-year-old or younger than that. Also, there are a few pictures in here that draw out boobs. So if that's not something you want to expose a child to, or something you don't want to see yourself, heads up that it's not entirely a clean read. Nothing in here is like gratuitous, like sex, but like it's part of the human experience, and it is included in here. Some of it's like antique art, some of it's like a woman breastfeeding in one scene. So, fair warning. So let me know in the comments below if you have read Moonbound and what you thought of it. Are you going to read it now? Are there any other books about the Apollo 11 mission or space travel in general that I should be reading? I will also post links to the other books about space that I've been reading in honor of the Apollo 11's 50th anniversary. So I read Shoot for the Moon by James Donovan, which is a nonfiction book that is the one that really went in depth into everything. I also read No Dream Too High by Buzz Aldrin, which is personal experiences from one of the men who walked on the moon. And I will also link Hidden Figures down below by Margaret Lee Shetterly, which really looks at the female African-American computer programmers that it took, that NASA used, and the role that they played, and it is amazing. So, peace out, I love you guys, and keep reading. Bye!